Have you ever felt the overwhelming, desperate urge to completely erase yourself? To step off the spinning axis of your daily routine, pack a bag, and vanish into the scenery of somewhere entirely unknown? It is a common fantasy. When the noise of the world becomes deafening, we crave the silence of isolation. We want to be where no one knows our name, where our history cannot follow us. But there is a terrifying vulnerability in seeking out the absolute margins of the world. When you strip away the safety net of community, the neighbors next door, the ambient glow of streetlight, the watchful eyes of a crowded city, you leave yourself exposed. Because when you step into the empty spaces, you never truly know who or what is already waiting for you in the dark. Tonight, we examine 3 separate accounts from individuals who deliberately sought out the isolated, the abandoned, and the forgotten. 3 harrowing journeys into places where no one was supposed to be. And 3 horrifying realizations that emptiness is rarely a guarantee of solitude. Settle in, check the locks on your doors, and listen carefully. Our first descent into isolation takes us to a rugged, windswept patch of land off the coast of Maine. The narrator, a young man of 22 at the time, was carrying the heavy psychological weight of severe professional burnout. Compounding this exhaustion was a personal history he carefully describes only as colorful. He was desperately attempting to sever the ties to previous, darker chapters of his life. He felt as though he were sleepwalking through his own existence, watching his days play out from behind a pane of frosted glass. He needed a sanctuary, a place to disappear. The idea came casually from a co-worker who had overheard his frustrations. Mike. This colleague painted a picture of a tiny, aggressively unremarkable island off the northeastern seaboard. It was the kind of place that actively repelled excitement. There was no bustling nightlife, no illuminated boardwalks, and a tourist population that exclusively consisted of day trippers who faithfully fled back to the mainland on the evening ferry. The co-worker explained that if you booked a room and stayed past sunset, the island effectively belonged entirely to you. It sounded like absolute perfection. Within moments, the young man found a listing for a standalone waterfront cabin. It was suspiciously affordable and miraculously available for immediate booking. A more cautious mind might have recognized these variables as glaring red flags, but desperation breeds reckless decisions. He booked it without a second thought. The structure was incredibly modest, a single, cramped room holding nothing but a basic bed, a kitchenette that appeared untouched by human hands, and a suffocating light bathroom. The cabin was shoved back from the rocky shoreline, hemmed in on 3 sides by thick, aggressive coastal foliage that physically scraped against the exterior walls. The front door faced the churning Atlantic, flanked by a single window covered only by a uselessly sheer curtain. You could see out, but more terrifyingly, anyone standing in the dark could see in. The walls were paper thin, offering zero acoustic protection from the wind howling through the brush. Yet, bizarrely, the front door was fortified with a heavy-duty deadbolt and a thick steel chain lock that gleamed with recent installation. Why would an isolated shack in a crime-free ghost town require fortress-level hardware? He pushed the anomaly from his mind. He arrived on the late afternoon ferry. As dusk began to swallow the sky, he took a solitary walk along the coast, watching the surreal mass exodus of tourists returning to the mainland. As the sun vanished, so did humanity. The island went pitch black. There were no ambient city sounds, no glowing street lamps, just the crushing, infinite void of the ocean. He stopped for a quick meal at a modest tavern near the docks. The bartender was perfectly amiable, until he casually mentioned the specific shorefront cabin he was renting. Her friendly demeanor instantly hardened into a tight, strained grimace. She offered no words of warning, but her silence carried a heavy weight. Walking back to his rental, his flashlight beam swept past a small, hidden dock nestled inside a rocky sea cave, roughly 100 yards from his front door. Tied to the cleats was a sleek, bright blue motorboat. It was a jarring splash of modern engineering in a sea of rusted, bulky lobster vessels. He noted it, filed it away, and kept walking. By 10:30 he was sealed inside the cabin. He threw the heavy deadbolt and slid the steel chain into place, ready to finally exhale. But the modern world offered one last frustration. His phone charger refused to draw power. He tested every outlet in the flimsy walls, but the battery icon remained a flashing, angry read. His lifeline to the outside world was going to die within the hour. Rationalizing that his physical ferry ticket was all he truly needed for the morning, he surrendered to his exhaustion, collapsing onto the bed and plummeting into a heavy, dreamless sleep. He does not know what woke him. He only knows that his eyes suddenly snapped open in the suffocating darkness, his senses dialed to a razor-sharp frequency. And then he heard it. The agonizing, deliberate crunch of heavy boots on the gravel outside. It was terrifyingly close, directly outside the front door. This was not the frantic scrambling of local wildlife. These were the calculated by dull footfalls of a large human being, pausing for a long, tortuous second between each step. He lay paralyzed in the bed. He shifted his weight, just a fraction of an inch to relieve a cramping muscle. The footsteps instantly ceased. The silence that flooded the cabin was predatory. It was thick and heavy, stretching out for agonizing minutes. He stared blankly at the ceiling, his mind frantically attempting to weave a blanket of rationalization over his terror. It's just an animal. It's just the wind. He refused to move. He barely allowed his lungs to draw in oxygen. Then, the heavy crunch of gravel resumed, and this time, they were not passing by. They were marching directly up to the threshold. The intruders stopped squarely in front of the door. The young man's heart began to detonate against his ribs with such violence that he felt certain the person outside could hear it vibrating through the floorboard. Suddenly, a blinding beam of harsh, white light pierced the sheer curtain. The trespassers had pressed a high-powered flashlight directly against the glass, silently scanning the interior of the single room. The young man lay petrified, trapped in the beam's periphery, unable to even twitch. The light snapped off. A heavy hand gripped the exterior, or handle. Click, clack. The handle twisted, but the fresh deadbolt held its ground. The young man squeezed his eyes shut, begging the universe that a locked door would be enough of a deterrent to send the prowler back into the night. A few seconds ticked by. The intruder threw their entire body weight against the wood. Bang, bang, like, bang. Explosive, deafening impacts rattled the flimsy cabin. The walls violently shook. The sheer aggression of the assault shattered the young man's paralysis. Pure, unadulterated survival instinct took the wheel. While the fists hammered against the door, he threw himself off the mattress, scrambling across the floorboards to crouch directly beneath the locked handle, bracing himself for the wood to splinter. He was ready for the absolute worst. But the door did not break. The assault stopped as suddenly as it had begun. He knelt there in the dark, gasping silently, waiting for the final blow. And then, a voice slithered through the cheap wood of the door. It was a man's voice. Light, low, steady, and completely unfamiliar. "I know you're in there, Leo." The sound of his own name was a physical blow. Light. His legs went numb. Light. This was not a random burglary. This was a targeted hunt. The heavy boots stepped off a small porch and began to slowly, methodically drag through the gravel, circling the perimeter of the cabin. The hunter was taking his time, pacing past the bathroom wall, tracing the exterior in a terrifying orbit. He was playing with his food. Time lost. Oh, meter. It could have been 20 minutes. It could have been an hour. Leo sat huddled on the floor, vibrating with terror, silently begging the man to just break the door down and end the psychological torture. Eventually, the crunching footsteps began to fade, retreating back toward the rocky shoreline. Moments later, the sputtering roar of a small outboard motor violently tore through the ambient sound of the ocean. From the direction of the hidden sea cave, the blue motorboat peeled away from the island, its engine gradually swallowed by the vast distance of the open water. Leo did not sleep. He sat awake, clutching his knees until the sun finally breached the horizon. When he opened the door, the gravel confirmed his worst fears. Deep, heavy boot prints circled his cabin over and over again, before marching in a perfectly straight, unwavering line directly down to the water's edge at the cavern dock. He fled the island that morning in a haze of trauma. Upon returning home, he cornered his co-worker, demanding to know who he had leaked the travel plans to. But the co-worker was genuinely horrified, swearing up and down that he had never breathed a word of the trip to anyone. Leo believed him. But that belief leaves behind a terrifying, unsolvable puzzle. Leo is a man with a dark past, a past he acknowledges might harbor individuals who wish him harm. But how on earth did they find him? How did a ghost from his previous life track him to an unnamed speck of rock off the coast of Maine? How did they know exactly which cabin he had rented, and on which specific night? And the most chilling realization of all, Leo still lives in the same city. He still works the same job. He returned to the exact life he was trying to escape. Nothing has changed, which means whoever stood on that porch in the dead of night, whispering his name through the door, knows exactly where he is. Our second journey takes us far from the shores of New England, across the globe to the salty, decaying air of the Pacific Ocean. It is a story told by a seasoned structural engineer, a man whose entire career is rooted in logic, mathematics, and the predictable decay of physical materials. But what he encountered defied all rational calculation. Many years ago, he was deep in the agonizing final stages of his graduate thesis, extensively researching the degradation of reinforced concrete in hostile marine environments. It was an incredibly dry subject, but it possessed one massive perk. It secured him an invitation to an academic conference in Nagasaki, Japan. During his research, he had struck up a correspondence with a prestigious local professor named Dr. Yamamoto, an expert in post-industrial decay. Dr. Yamamoto utilized his considerable influence to arrange a miracle for the young engineer, a highly restricted, government-approved research permit to physically enter the ruins of Hasume Island. For those unaware, Hasume is a microscopic island off the coast of Nagasaki that looks uncannily like a massive, concrete battleship rising from the waves. During its peak, it was a thriving undersea gold mining facility, boasting one of the highest population densities ever recorded on Earth. A towering labyrinth of brutalized concrete apartment blocks was erected to house the workers and their families. But when the coal veins were exhausted in the 1972, the corporation simply abandoned it. The entire city was left to rot. Today, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Casual tourists are permitted to land, but they are strictly confined to a reinforced walkway along the outer seawall. Setting foot inside the crumbling, unstable apartment complexes is legally and strictly forbidden. The structures are rotting from the inside out. But the engineer was granted an exception. After signing a terrifying stack of liability waivers absolving the government of his potential death, he boarded a private, non-tourist vessel early in the morning. His only companion was his state-appointed escort, a man named Takashi. Takashi was a silent, brooding figure who radiated deep annoyance at having to babysit a foreign academic. The approach to Hasume is a surreal optical illusion. From a distance, it looks like a small, jagged rock. But as the boat draws closer, the sheer, oppressive scale of the seawall and the stacked, decaying towers aggressively dominates the skyline. Upon docking, Takashi delivered a sharp, uncompromising briefing. The rules were absolute. Stay on the approved paths. Never cross-read hazard tape. Do not remove a single pebble. And above all else, stay within his visual range at all times. Takashi repeated that final rule twice, locking eyes with the engineer. Outfitted in a heavy hard hat, reinforced trousers, and steel-toed boots, the engineer eagerly stepped into the ruins. For the first few hours, it was academic paradise. He was entirely consumed by the magnificent decay, photographing rusted rebar and spalling concrete. Takashi trailed distantly behind, constantly checking his watch, telegraphing his desire to leave. Around midday, they breached the dark threshold of one of the massive residential blocks. The concrete stairwells were terrifyingly unstable, with large chunks missing from the landings, revealing a deadly drop to the ground below. Bizarrely, Takashi stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Ignoring his own cardinal rule about maintaining visual contact, he gestured for the engineer to ascend alone, opting to wait on the ground floor. The engineer found it odd but was relieved to shed his babysitter's sour energy. He climbed to the fourth floor, stepping into a long, silent corridor lined with empty family apartments. He was deeply engrossed in examining a heavily degraded section of the load-bearing wall when a subtle anomaly on the floor caught his eye. Hazame is coated in decades of undisturbed, thick gray dust, but running directly down the center of this hallway was a distinct, compacted path. It wasn't a fresh set of footprints, but rather a smooth depression in the grime, indicating that someone, or something, had walked this exact route repeatedly, over a long period of time, tamping the dust down flat. His eyes tracked the unnatural trail to a closed door at the far end of the corridor. Like logic dictated he retreat and alert Takashi. Curiosity demanded he investigate. He quietly approached the door and gently pushed it open. Instantly, two deeply unsettling sensations assaulted him. First was the odor. A thick, bizarre smell radiated from the room. It was not the scent of rotting wood or dead animals. It was entirely unrecognizable, completely devoid of any familiar human chemistry, yet undeniably organic. It made the hair on his arms stand up. But the second anomaly was far more impossible. The engineer pressed his bare hand against the concrete wall inside the room. It was warm. Light, not room temperature. It was noticeably, actively hot to the touch. He stood there for 30 agonizing seconds, his brain frantically searching for a rational explanation. There were no skylights allowing the sun to bake the stone. There was no electricity. And there were no animals documented on the island large enough to generate that kind of localized, radiating body heat. Deeply unnerved, he hurried back down the crumbling stairs to report his findings to his escort. Takashi's reaction was terrifyingly subdued. He didn't ask a single follow-up question. He didn't express an ounce of concern. He simply stared blankly and stated that the engineer's observations were impossible, as the island was completely devoid of life. When the engineer aggressively insisted Takashi follow him upstairs to feel the wall and smell the air, Takashi flatly, coldly refused. The atmosphere instantly turned hostile. As they continued their tour, the engineer was no longer looking at concrete. He was looking for signs of life, and they were everywhere. Strange markings on door frames, unnatural arrangements of debris. He pointed them out, but Takashi offered nothing but stony silence. At one point, after highlighting yet another anomaly, Takashi completely ignored him, unclipped a heavy radio from his belt, and began speaking frantically in rapid-fire Japanese. It was the first time he had used the device all day. When the engineer demanded to know who he was speaking to, Takashi smoothly lied, claiming he was simply checking the ferry schedule. The engineer felt a sickening plunge in his stomach. Takashi knew. He was aware of whatever was inhabiting the island, and he was actively concealing it. They eventually arrived at the tallest, most imposing residential tower near the center of the complex. This time, Takashi's demeanor violently shifted. He hesitated at the entrance, standing perfectly still for a long moment, before practically gluing himself to the engineer's back. The bored indifference was gone, replaced by a hyper-vigilant, nervous energy. They ascended 5 flights of narrow, pitch-black stairs. They stepped into a gloomy corridor and entered a corner apartment. And there, pressed against the far wall, was undeniable, absolute proof. A thick pile of filthy blankets, arranged into a makeshift bed, surrounded by several empty, modern plastic water bottles. It was definitive evidence of human habitation. The engineer gasped, his mind reeling with the implications. He immediately spun around, ready to shove this undeniable reality right into Takashi's face, ready to demand an evacuation. But the doorway was completely empty. Takashi had vanished. Without a single sound, without a whisper of a footstep, his escort was gone. The sudden, crushing isolation slammed into the engineer like a physical blow. Standing alone in a room clearly occupied by someone hiding in the dark, his brain finally shattered the illusion of safety. He was trapped on an abandoned island, deep inside a labyrinth of rotting concrete, and the inhabitants were watching him. A violent, instinctual panic seized his body. His skin crawled with a frantic need to shed his heavy safety gear and sprint for his life. He bolted from the apartment, hauling himself back toward the stairwell they had just ascended. He was going to run down, sprint to the dock, and steal the boat if he had to. He rounded the corner. The stairwell was completely blocked. A massive pile of concrete rubble, shattered glass, and twisted rebar was stacked waist-high across the landing. He had not been there 5 minutes prior. Someone had intentionally, silently barricaded his only known exit. He didn't waste a second pondering the physics of it. He spun on his heels and blindly sprinted down the pitch-black corridor, desperately searching for a secondary stairwell. He no longer cared about structural integrity. He didn't care if his heavy boots brought the ceiling down. He only cared about escaping the hunt. As he sprinted down the hall, he heard it. From the shadows behind him, a door groaned. Then, the distinct, rapid sound of footsteps stepping out into the hallway. He refused to turn his head. He pushed his legs faster, treating the crumbling building like a horrific maze, taking blind corners in the dark. But the nightmare escalated. The echoing acoustics of the long concrete hallway amplified the terror behind him. It was no longer one set of footsteps. The sound multiplied. He could hear multiple individuals, running in unison, their feet slapping aggressively against the stone, actively pursuing him through the dark. By pure, adrenaline-fueled luck, he crashed through a rusted doorway and discovered a secondary set of stairs. He practically threw himself down the stairwell, violently bouncing off the walls until he burst out into the blinding, salty daylight of the courtyard. He sprinted across the broken ground, his chest heaving, until his boots slammed onto the wooden dock. Standing there, perfectly still beside the idling boat, was Takashi. The sheer, unbothered calm on Takashi's face mutated the engineer's terror into explosive, uncontrollable rage. He screamed at the escort. He wildly pointed at the towers, detailing the blankets, the barricaded stairs, the pack of hunters chasing him through the dark. He accused Takashi of abandoning him, of conspiring with the inhabitants, of actively trying to trap him in the building. Takashi did not blink. He stared at the screaming engineer with dead, hollow eyes. He offered no denial. He offered no comfort. He simply waited for the engineer to run out of breath, and calmly stated, "We are leaving." The young man was utterly powerless. Takashi controlled the only exit. He was forced to endure a terrifying, silent ferry ride back to the mainland, sitting rigidly in the stern, genuinely fearful that the escort might throw him into the churning ocean. Upon reaching safety, the engineer immediately attempted to blow the whistle. He needed to expose the horrifying reality of what was festering on Hazime. His first and only point of contact was the man who arranged the trip, Dr. Yamamoto. But the phone rang endlessly. Emails bounced back. Over the next several weeks, even after returning to the safety of the United States, the engineer relentlessly tried to track the professor down. He contacted authorities, submitted reports, and screamed into the void. Like, nothing happened. And Dr. Yamamoto, it was as if the man had been entirely erased from existence. To this day, the engineer is haunted not just by the footsteps in the dark, but by the horrific realization that the people operating in the shadows possess the power to make prestigious academics completely disappear. He will never know who was living in that concrete tower. And he will never know how close he came to joining them permanently. Our final descent into the macabre brings us back to the crowded, hyper-surveilled streets of America. We are conditioned to believe that true isolation is impossible in a major metropolis. But history has left deep, festering wounds right in our own backyards, blind spots where the rules of civilization no longer apply. Over a decade ago, our narrator was battling his way through the final semester of his college career. As a history major, he was entirely consumed by a massive senior thesis focusing on the architecture of abandoned institutional spaces. He was obsessed with the decaying husks of defunct asylums, quarantine hospitals, and rehabilitation centers that sit rotting within the borders of massive urban environments. The crown jewel of his research was North Brother Island. For those unacquainted with New York's darker history, North Brother is a dense, heavily forested island floating right in the middle of the East River, geographically wedged between the Bronx and Rikers Island. In its grim past, it served as a brutal quarantine hospital for highly infectious, terminal diseases. It was the forced home of Typhoid Mary. Decades later, it was repurposed into a draconian rehabilitation facility for teenage drug addicts. Eventually, the city deemed it a failure, locked the doors, and surrendered it to nature. Today, it is a heavily guarded, strictly off-limits bird sanctuary. Unauthorized entry is a serious federal offense. The student had no initial intention of actually trespassing. But late one night, fueled by a few drinks and the crushing stress of academia, he began venting about the island to his two closest friends, Jansen and Jesse. Rather than being bored by his historical rambling, his friends were instantly captivated. It was the height of the urban exploration trend, an era where young men sought out decaying infrastructure for the sheer adrenaline rush. The revelation that an illegal, post-apocalyptic ghost town was sitting entirely abandoned right in their own city was an intoxicating temptation. They relentlessly pressured the history major to be their guide. His own academic curiosity, the desire to see the subject of his thesis with his own eyes, finally broke his resolve. Late, weeks later, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the three friends found themselves dragging 3 plastic kayaks through the dew-soaked grass of Barreto Point Park in the Bronx. Under the cover of total darkness, they quietly slipped the boats into the freezing, oily waters of the East River. The paddle across the channel was grueling and tense. But as their kayaks scraped against the muddy, overgrown shoreline of North Brother Island, the reality of their situation slammed into them. They dragged the boats into the tall reeds to hide them, standing shoulder to shoulder in the pitch black. The absolute silence of the island was suffocating. What? They were technically standing inside New York City. The glowing, electric skyline of the Bronx was clearly visible, just a half-mile across the water. Yet, surrounded by the aggressive overgrowth of the island, it felt as though humanity had been extinct for 1,000 years. There was no hum of traffic, no distant sirens, just the rustle of dead branches and the oppressive weight of the past. They pushed inland, their flashlights carving narrow beams through the dark. The sheer size of the complex stunned them. Massive, ornate brick buildings were being slowly crushed by nature. Thick, serpentine vines strangled support columns. In one surreal moment, Jesse aimed his light at a towering oak tree that had literally grown up directly through the center of a hospital ward, violently splitting the masonry in half. It was a scene ripped straight from a dystopian nightmare. The island was actively trying to digest the evidence that humans had ever suffered there. They cautiously entered one of the sprawling, structurally intact hospital wings. The air inside was foul, thick with the smell of mold, rotting wood, and decades of undisturbed dust. In a massive central room, Jansen's flashlight illuminated a half-empty can of spray paint discarded on the floor. Instantly, the urge to vandalize took over. Jesse eagerly encouraged him. The history major protested. He argued vehemently that spraying graffiti over a site where thousands of terrified, sick people had died in agony was profoundly disrespectful. But his friends laughed it off, sweeping their lights over the walls to show him the elaborate, faded tags left by previous trespassers. Realizing he was fighting a losing battle, the narrator threw his hands up in frustration. He told them he was going to explore the adjacent wings alone to gather mental notes for his thesis, leaving them to their vandalism. It was a catastrophic mistake. There's an invisible buffer of psychological safety when you are exploring a terrifying place with a group. But the moment his friend's voices faded, the crushing, haunted atmosphere of the hospital ward wrapped around him like a suffocating blanket. He was creeping slowly down a massive, pitch-black hallway lined with dozens of empty, cavernous patient rooms. The silence was ringing in his ears. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the darkness ahead of him. "Hey!" It was Jesse's voice. The narrator jumped, his heart skipping a beat. He aimed his flashlight down the long, empty corridor, but the beam revealed nothing but swirling dust. His brain scrambled to make sense of the spatial impossibility. For Jesse to be ahead of him, he would have had to immediately abandon Jansen, sprint silently through a maze of uncharted, pitch-black hallways, and loop entirely around the building just to get in front of him. Why on earth would he do that? "Jesse, wait," he called out, his voice trembling in the dark. An immediate response came from an open doorway just a few feet ahead of him, on the left side of the hall. "In here." It was Jansen's voice. Like, the exact pitch, the exact cadence. It was a perfect, flawless audio replica. The narrator exhaled, a wave of annoyance washing over his fear. He assumed his friends had conspired to run ahead and set up a childish jump scare in the dark. It was exactly the kind of obnoxious prank Jansen would find hilarious. Without hesitation, the narrator stepped confidently into the dark doorway and swung his flashlight beam into the room. The light swept across the peeling plaster and violently halted on a figure standing in the farthest, darkest corner of the room. The narrator's brain desperately tried to process the image. He tried to force the silhouette to be his friend playing a joke. But logic instantly collapsed. The figure had its back completely turned, facing the rotting brick wall. And it was impossibly, terrifyingly tall. It easily stood 6.5, perhaps 7 feet high. The proportions were entirely unnatural, its limbs hanging at grotesque, wrong angles. Neither Jansen nor Jesse were anywhere near that height. A wave of pure, unfiltered primal terror shattered his sanity. A guttural, involuntary scream ripped from his lungs. He didn't slowly back away. He spun on his heels and fled with the explosive, desperate speed of hunted prey. He tore down the pitch-black hallway, screaming at the absolute top of his lungs for his friends to run. He was entirely convinced that the towering monstrosity in the dark was right behind him, reaching out to snap his neck. He burst into the central foyer, just as Jansen and Jesse came sprinting out of the opposite wing, their eyes wide with genuine panic at his horrific screams. He didn't stop to explain. He grabbed them by their jackets and hauled them toward the exit, babbling incoherently about the massive entity in the corner. At first, they thought he was having a psychotic break, but as they scrambled blindly through the thorny brush toward the shoreline, the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from him infected them. Panic is contagious. They crashed through the reeds, desperately grabbing the handles of their kayaks. And then, the island delivered its final, horrifying blow. As they dragged the boats toward the freezing water, a sound rose from the impenetrable darkness of the trio, and directly behind them. It stopped all three of them dead in their tracks. It was the frail, wavering sound of an old woman. She was moaning. It was a long, drawn-out wail of profound physical agony and deep, unending sorrow, echoing faintly through the dead trees. It was not an animal. It was not the wind grinding branches together. It was distinctly undeniably human. No one spoke. With trembling hands on racing hearts, they threw the kayaks into the East River and paddled with a violent ferocity, tearing the muscles in their shoulders, refusing to look back until the bows of their boats struck the concrete shores of the Bronx. They sat in the safety of a locked car for hours, shivering violently, endlessly dissecting the timeline of the night, desperate to find a logical explanation to cling to. But the math refused to cooperate. Jesse swore on his life that he had never left Jansen's side in the spray paint room. Jansen aggressively confirmed the alibi, which left the history major with a terrifying, irrefutable reality that haunts him to this day. There is something living in the rotting, abandoned heart of North Brother Island. Something towering, utterly unnaturally. Something that knew his name. And most horrifying of all, something that possessed the terrifying ability to perfectly mimic the voices of his closest friends, luring him directly into the dark. Isolation is a dangerous gamble. We seek out the empty spaces to escape the watching eyes of the world, to find peace where the map simply goes blank. But in doing so, we strip away our own defenses. We willingly walk into the shadows, assuming they are empty. Whether it is a targeted stalker hunting you across the ocean to a rocky shore in Maine, a silent, hostile community residing in the concrete decay of Hazame, or a towering mimic stalking the forgotten wards of an island in the East River. The lesson remains chillingly clear. When you wander far enough into the empty dark, you might just find that it was waiting for you all along. Lock your doors. Stay in the light. And remember, you are rarely as alone as you think. There is a specific kind of terror that belongs entirely to the fog. It is a weather phenomenon that actively robs you of your senses, wrapping you in a claustrophobic white wall that swallows light, dead ENS sound, and erases the horizon. When the fog rolls in, the world shrinks to the few feet directly in front of your face. You are entirely blind to whatever is sharing the dark with you. Our next account takes us to the winding, treacherous asphalt of the Pacific coast, where the fog is not just a weather pattern, it is a predator. It was the year 2022. I was living in Oakland at the time, but I had made the long drive up to Eureka, in Northern California, to spend the weekend with my parents. If you are unfamiliar with the geography of rural Highway 101, you need to understand its dual nature. Under the sunlight, it is a breathtaking ribbon of coastal highway. But at night, once you push north of the Bay Area, it transforms into a desolate, winding nightmare. Cell service evaporates. Street lights are non-existent. You are completely at the mercy of the dark. I made the foolish decision to leave my parents' house around 8 o'clock on a Sunday night. I had an early work shift the following morning, and my stubbornness convinced me I could power through the long, dark to the long. It is a decision that haunts me to this day. The first couple of hours were uneventful. The highway had bottlenecked it into a narrow, two-lane rural road, walled in by towering trees on either side. I was somewhere near the coastal town of Trinidad when the atmosphere abruptly changed. The fog didn't just drift in. It collapsed on top of the highway. Within a span of 5 minutes, my visibility plummeted from perfectly clear to virtually zero. I couldn't see 20 feet past the hood of my car. It was a suffocating, impenetrable blanket of white. I tapped my brakes, dropping my speed down to a cautious 35 miles per hour. The logical move would have been to pull onto the shoulder and wait for the marine layer to burn off. But that stretch of the 101 is notoriously unforgiving, offering almost nowhere safe to pull over. Furthermore, the thick fog had completely scrambled my spatial awareness, with no visible landmarks, no moonlight, and no center line to guide me. I felt like I was floating through a sensory deprivation egg. Roughly 30 minutes into this white-knuckle navigation, my headlights caught a shape on the right side of the highway. At first, my tired brain registered it merely as a tall vertical mass on the gravel shoulder, perhaps 50 feet ahead. But as my car crawled closer, the high beams carved through the mist to reveal a human being. It was a man, exceptionally tall, standing mere inches from the white line. He wasn't walking. He wasn't waving his arms in distress. He wasn't illuminated by the glow of a cell phone screen. He was just standing there, facing the asphalt, perfectly rigid. I eased off the gas, my foot hovering over the brake pedal, terrified he might suddenly step into my lane. But he didn't twitch. As my car glided past him, I stared through the passenger window. He didn't turn his head to track my headlights. He remained entirely static, like a mannequin planted in the dirt. I caught a fleeting glimpse of his face. There was nothing monstrous or visually horrific about his features, which somehow made the encounter infinitely worse. My rational mind desperately tried to build a narrative. His car broke down, HES waiting for a tow truck. But the highway was completely devoid of other vehicles. There was no broken down car, no hazard lights, no intersecting trails. Just a lone man, standing in the middle of nowhere, staring at the empty road. A deep, primal unease settled in my gut. I debated turning around, but survival instinct screamed at me to keep my foot on the gas. 10 minutes later, the nightmare shattered all logic. My headlights pierced the gloom, and there, standing on the left shoulder of the highway, was the exact same man. I gasped aloud, my voice echoing in the empty cabin of my car. It was impossible. He had the identical tall build, the identical dark clothing, the identical, rigid posture. But there was absolutely no physical way this man could have bypassed my car on foot, and there were no parallel roads he could have used to cut ahead. The only logical, albeit highly unlikely, explanation was that I was looking at an identical twin, wearing identical clothes, standing in the exact same unnerving stance. I didn't want to look at him as I passed. Every fiber of my being told me to keep my eyes glued to the steering wheel. But morbid curiosity is a powerful force. As my car crept by, I turned my head to look out the driver's side window. This time, he moved. His head snapped violently to the side, and his eyes locked directly onto mine. The eye contact was electric, sending a paralyzing jolt of sheer terror down my spine. I slammed my foot on the accelerator. I didn't care about the fog anymore. I pushed the speedometer up to 45, desperate to put as much distance between my rear bumper and whatever that thing was. But the environment fought back. The fog thickened into an opaque, soupy paste. I completely lost sight of the yellow center line. I was forced to slam on the brakes to avoid driving off the unseen cliff edge. My brain was misfiring, torn between the exhaustion of a 4-hour drive and the adrenaline of pure panic. I tried to convince myself I was suffering from severe highway hypnosis. It's just your brain playing tricks on you in the fog. 3 minutes later, the illusion of safety was permanently destroyed. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, revealing a third figure. But this one wasn't standing on the shoulder. He was standing dead center in my lane, entirely blocking the highway. I slammed the brakes, the tires screaming against the damp asphalt as my car shuddered to a complete halt. This figure was wearing a dark hood, completely obscuring his face. He stood motionless in the glare of my high beams. My hand shook violently against the steering wheel. I flashed my brakes at him, a desperate, frantic warning to move. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at me through the white glare. Panic seized my chest. I threw the transmission into reverse, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror to check my clearance. My blood turned to ice. Illuminated by the red glow of my taillights was another person. He was directly behind my car, slowly, methodically creeping toward my trunk. I was boxed in. I screamed expletives into the empty car, slamming the gear shift back into drive. This was no longer a Bowser encounter. This was an ambush. I cranked the steering wheel hard to the right, violently swerving into the oncoming lane, completely blind to potential oncoming traffic, desperate to bypass the hooded figure blocking my path. I cleared him. I thought I had escaped. And then, an explosive, violent force slammed into the back of my car. It wasn't a gentle bump. It was a massive, concussive impact. The entire rear chassis of my car was violently jolted to the right, throwing me against my seatbelt. The sickening, deafening crunch of metal collapsing inward filled the cabin. I kept my foot pinned to the floor, fighting the steering wheel to regain control, convinced I had just been rear-ended by another vehicle hiding in the fog. I threw my eyes to the rearview mirror, bracing to see the crumpled hood of an attacking car. The road behind me was completely empty. There were no headlights. There was no damaged vehicle. There were no figures standing in the mist. There was absolutely nothing. I drove like a madman until I finally hit the massive concrete interchange for the 101, where the fog magically dissipated. And the glowing lights of the Bay Area welcomed me back to reality. As my adrenaline crashed, my rational brain aggressively tried to rewrite the entire night. You were exhausted. You were hallucinating. You fell asleep at the wheel for a microsecond and dreamt the entire thing. It was the only way my brain could process the trauma. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was desperate to crawl into bed and sleep off the nightmare. But as I walked around to the back of my vehicle to grab my bags, the rationalization shattered. My rear bumper was completely destroyed. A massive, deep crater was crushed into the steel and plastic, running the entire width of the trunk. I stood there in the dead of night, staring at the wreckage. I ran my hand along the dent. There was zero paint transfer. If I had been rear-ended by another vehicle, there would be scrapes of their paint embedded in my bumper. If I had backed into a concrete barricade, there would be deep scratches in concrete, dust. But the metal was simply crushed inward by an invisible, massive force. I filed a police report, but I knew it was useless. I have spent the last 4 years agonizing over the mechanics of that night. The only logical compromise my brain will accept is that I hallucinated the tall men, panic, and blindly struck a guardrail in the fog. But deep down in the darkest corners of my mind, I know the truth. I know what it feels like to experience a hallucination, and I know what it feels like to be actively hunted by something that does not obey the laws of reality. Whatever was standing in the fog that night didn't just want to scare me. It wanted to stop me. The fog does not only manipulate the environment, it manipulates the mind. It warps the geometry of familiar spaces, turning the places we know by heart into alien, hostile territory. Our next account takes place just a few weeks ago, during the quiet lull of a university spring break. I am currently a college senior. Like many students, I returned to my suburban hometown for the week. The problem with my hometown is that it exists in a frustrating purgatory, close enough to a major city to be expensive, but entirely lacking the vibrant nightlife or walkability of an actual metropolis. To make matters worse, my handful of high school friends were all operating on different academic schedules. I was staring down the barrel of a completely empty, mind-numbing week of isolation. Recently, I have been making a concerted effort to purge some bad habits from my life, specifically nicotine and alcohol. I knew that sitting idle in my childhood bedroom was a guaranteed recipe for relapse. To combat the boredom, I engineered a strict physical regimen. I would lift weights in the morning and run long distances in the afternoon. It was a strategy designed to physically exhaust me, so I couldn't overthink. On a random Tuesday afternoon, I laced up my running shoes to tackle a familiar route. Back in my high school cross-country days, I ran a very specific 3-mile loop that started undented at my front door. The route traced through the manicured sidewalks of my subdivision for a quarter mile, before abruptly cutting into a dense, heavily wooded nature trail. The dirt path snaked through the forest for a couple of miles before spitting you back out onto the pavement. Just a block away from my house. I had run this exact loop hundreds of times. The woods were my favorite segment. The soft dirt was forgiving on the knees, and the total acoustic isolation provided a meditative silence. I stepped out of my front door around 5 o'clock. The sun wasn't scheduled to set for hours, but visibility was already severely compromised. A bizarre, unnatural fog had swallowed the neighborhood. It was thick, heavy, and completely static. It didn't look like coastal marine weather. It looked artificial, like the low-resolution render distance in an old video game. Everything beyond 40 feet simply dissolved into a gradient of white haze. I momentarily considered abandoning the workout, but my stubbornness won out. The woodland trail was a single, unbroken line. There were no forks, no intersecting paths, no chance of getting lost. I knew the topography blindfolded. I activated the GPS tracking on my Garmin smartwatch, jogged through the hazy suburban streets, and crossed the threshold into the woods. Underneath the thick canopy of trees, the fog was concentrated into a suffocating light and vapor. But visibility dropped to 15 feet. For the first mile and a half, everything proceeded normally. My pace was slightly sluggish due to the visual impairment, but I felt strong. I checked my wrist at the 1-mile mark, and again at the halfway point. The anomaly began around mile 2.5. Based on my intimate knowledge of the trail, the 2.5-mile mark dictates the specific geographical shift. The dirt path is supposed to bank sharply to the left, ascend a steep, short incline, and deposit you back onto the concrete sidewalk. But as I glanced down at my watch and saw 50 miles glowing on the digital face, I looked up and saw nothing but an endless tunnel of trees. I was still deep in the belly of the woods. I rationalized the discrepancy immediately. My Garmin was 4 years old, and the heavy tree canopy, combined with the bizarre atmospheric density of the fog, was likely scrambling the satellite connection. I assumed I was simply running slower than the watch calculated. I kept my breathing steady and pushed forward. Then my watch ticked over to 0 miles. At 3 miles I should have been standing in my driveway, stretching my calves. Instead, I was completely surrounded by suffocating white mist, running on the exact same dirt path, with absolutely no visual cue that the edge of the forest was approaching. I abruptly stopped running. I am not prone to superstition or paranoia. I am a creature of logic. I stood panting in the damp air, systematically trying to deduce how this was physically possible. I hadn't veered off the trail. I hadn't bushwhacked through the undergrowth. I had run in a perfectly straight, linear line. I raised my wrist. The GPS read 10 miles. And then, as I stood completely motionless, feet planted firmly in the dirt, the numbers on the screen slowly ticked up. 3.111. 3.12. 3.13. The watch was glitching. The hardware had failed. It was the only anchor of logic I had left. I faced a critical decision: keep blindly running forward into the infinite white, hoping the exit materialized, or turn around and trace my exact steps backward to the neighborhood entrance. The latter was the only sensible choice. I pivoted and began to jog back the way I came. The fog had thickened to a terrifying density. I had to severely throttle my pace, terrified I would accidentally step off the edge of the dirt path and become hopelessly lost in the deep brush. After tracking backward for roughly a mile, bringing my total physical exertion to over 4 miles, the absolute silence of the woods was violently broken. It started low, a sound that my brain instantly recognized as completely foreign to a small suburban forest. It was a drone. It sounded like a human vocal cord attempting to mimic an air raid siren. It was a deep, guttural moan that slowly swelled in volume, hit a terrifyingly high, vibrating pitch, and then smoothly descended back into a low rumble. It was perfectly sustained and rhythmic. It wasn't the frantic scream of an animal being killed, nor was it a human calling for help. It was entirely devoid of emotion. A surge of pure adrenaline flooded my exhausted muscles. I broke into a full sprint, but I had already been running for 4 miles. My glycogen stores were depleted. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, and the absolute horror of the situation was actively draining my stamina. The droning sound did not fade. Whoever, or whatever, was making that horrific noise was matching my sprint effortlessly. Every frantic, terrified glance over my shoulder revealed nothing but the swirling white wall of fog. I was being hunted by a phantom. I ran with the wailing siren vibrating in my ears for an agonizing eternity. Finally, the tree line broke. I burst out of the woods, my running shoes slapping violently against the blessed concrete of the suburban street. I collapsed onto the curb, dry heaving from total physical failure. The fog in the neighborhood was still obscenely thick. I slowly forced myself to stand, my chest heaving, and turned my head to look back at the entrance of the woodland trail. Standing dead center in the mouth of the path, perfectly framed by the mist, was a silhouette. It was a solid mass of absolute black, completely devoid of features or clothing. And it was impossibly, terrifyingly massive. I am a tall man, standing at 6'1", but the entity hovering at the edge of the woods easily eclipsed 7 feet. It did not step out onto the concrete. It did not retreat into the shadows. It simply stood there gently, methodically swaying back and forth like a pendulum. The droning sound had completely vanished. If it weren't for the rhythmic swaying, my desperate brain might have convinced me I was hallucinating a dead tree stump. But it was watching me. I could feel the weight of its unseen eyes crushing down on me. I didn't wait for it to take a step forward. I turned and sprinted the final block to my house, locking every door and collapsing on the floor. My parents, bless their rational hearts, tried to comfort me with logic. They insisted it was merely a tall, malicious prankster hiding in the woods to terrorize joggers. But their logic completely ignores the physics of the encounter. No human being of that immense size could sprint effortlessly through dense fog for miles, matching the pace of a seasoned cross-country runner, all while producing a flawless, fluctuating siren noise without ever needing to pause for breath. I am back at my university now, hundreds of miles away. But when I close my eyes, I am still trapped on that dirt path, listening to the sirens wail in the dark. Our final descent into the mist forces us off dry land, where the rules of physics and sound become even more distorted. 6 years ago, during the chill of late September, a man and his close friend, Edwin, finalized plans for an ambitious kayaking expedition. Their destination was Walapa Bay, located on the rugged Washington coast. The bay is a sprawling, 25-mile-long tidal estuary. It is a complex ecosystem of commercial oyster farms, shifting sandbars, and dense wildlife refuges. On a sunny day, it is a picturesque haven of natural tranquility. But the Saturday they chose to launch was anything but clear. It is crucial to note that neither man was a novice. Both had been navigating the waters since childhood, and Edwin had even spent several collegiate summers employed as a professional kayaking guide. They possessed marine GPS units, physical compasses, and a deep respect for the ocean. They were not amateurs prone to panicked hallucinations. They launched their kayaks from a remote slip near the town of Nakota early in the morning. A heavy, oppressive coastal fog blanketed the estuary, but they confidently predicted the marine layer would burn off as the sun climbed higher. Their itinerary was simple: paddle the open water toward Long Island, navigate the sandbars, and return before the afternoon tide reversed. For the first hour, the environment was peacefully eerie. Coastal fog has a unique acoustic property. It acts like heavy acoustic foam, deadening the ambient noise of the world and making you feel as though you are paddling through an infinite sea of cotton. wet. Visibility was capped at 40 feet. They paddled in a loose denim formation, maintaining visual contact and diligently checking their compass bearings. At roughly 9 o'clock, the unnatural silence was broken. Splash. Creak. Splash. It was the distinct, heavy sound of wooden oars turning in metal or locks. The narrator initially assumed Edwin had altered his paddling technique, but when he glanced to his left, he saw Edwin sitting perfectly still, his lightweight kayak paddle resting horizontally across his lap. Edwin locked eyes with him and gave a slow, tense nod. He heard it too. They allowed their kayaks to drift, straining their ears against the white void. The rhythmic splashing was undeniable. It wasn't the swift, slicing sound of a double-bladed kayak paddle. It was the heavy, laborious drag of a traditional rowboat, and it sounded incredibly close, perhaps 100 feet away, hidden entirely by the fog bank to their right. Edwin whispered that it was likely just a local fisherman tending to commercial crab pots. It was a completely rational assumption. Sound behaves erratically over open water in heavy fog, often amplifying distant noises to make them seem intimately close. Standard maritime etiquette in low visibility scenarios dictates that boaters should verbally announce their presence to avoid collisions. Edwin cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled a friendly greeting into the mist. There was no response. More unsettling than the silence was the utter lack of reaction. The heavy, rhythmic splash, creak, splash of the oars did not stutter, slow down, or alter its cadence in any way. Whoever was navigating the rowboat had completely ignored them. Assuming the invisible boater was simply antisocial, the two friends dipped their paddles back into the frigid water and resumed their course. Over the next 20 minutes, the situation morphed from slightly awkward to deeply terrifying. As the two men paddled, adjusting their speed and slightly altering their trajectory to navigate the currents, the sound of the rowboat remained perfectly synchronized with them. It never grew fainter. It never grew louder. It matched their exact speed, maintaining a perfectly parallel course in the blind spot of the fog gap. The mechanical, flawless rhythm of the oars pulling against the water became hypnotic, and then profoundly sinister. The silence between the two friends grew heavy. Without exchanging a word, they simultaneously angled their kayaks slightly eastward, hoping to pull closer to the safety of the shoreline. For 3 agonizing seconds, a sudden gust of wind tore a ragged hole in the fog bank. Through the narrow visual corridor, the narrator caught a crystal-clear glimpse of the water to their right. Gliding silently over the gray swells was a small, pitch-black wooden rowboat. Seated on the bench was the dark silhouette of a person, their hands gripping the oars. Before the narrator's brain could process any distinguishing features, the heavy mist violently closed the gap. The phantom boat was swallowed whole. He shot a panicked look at Edwin. Edwin's face was pale. He had seen it too. The atmosphere instantly shattered. They were no longer bird-watching. That they were being stalked. The narrator aggressively dug his paddle into the water, pivoting his kayak toward the invisible eastern shoreline, desperate to escape the open water. Edwin matched his frantic pace. Navigating a tidal estuary blind is incredibly dangerous. Mike, the bay is littered with hidden mudflats and shallow sandbars that can instantly beach a vessel. But the terror overriding their logic pushed them to paddle blindly southeast, moving as fast as their burning shoulders would allow out. And for the entire agonizing sprint, the methodical, heavy sound of the wooden oar stayed right beside them in the fog and in the fog. Then abruptly, the atmospheric pressure shifted. The dense fog didn't entirely vanish, but it rapidly thinned, instantly expanding their visibility to 100 yards in every direction. The narrator violently twisted his torso to the right, bracing himself to confront the black rowboat. The water was completely empty. Mike, there was no boat. There was no wake. There was absolutely nothing but gray, rolling water. He spun around, scanning the rear horizon. Empty. He looked at Edwin, whose eyes were wide with identical, unadulterated panic. The phantom roar had evaporated into thin air. Relief was violently overpowered by a deeper, more profound dread. A physical boat cannot simply cease to exist. 5 minutes later, the muddy, forested shoreline finally materialized out of the haze. They didn't bother scouting for a pristine launching ramp. They drove the noses of their kayak straight into the muddy shallows. The narrator vaulted out of his cockpit, the freezing water rushing up to his knees, his only thought focused on getting his boots onto solid land. They dragged the heavy plastic kayaks onto the rocky beach, standing in stunned, panting silence, staring back out at the vast, empty expanse of Walapa Bay. Edwin unclipped his life vest and began pacing nervously up the shoreline to bleed off his adrenaline. Suddenly, he froze. He called out, his voice shaking, demanding the narrator come look at the sand. The narrator jogged over, his eyes dropping to the ground. Carved into the wets, and were footprints. White. They were human, completely barefoot, and terrifyingly fresh. Tiny pools of salt water were still actively draining into the depressions of the heel strikes. Whoever had made them had stepped out of the freezing bay mere moments ago. But the trajectory of the footprints defied all logic. The tracks emerged directly from the lapping waves, walked a few feet up the muddy embankment toward the dense tree line, and then pivoted sharply. They traced a path perfectly parallel to the water's edge, marching down the shoreline, before abruptly cutting a sharp right angle and vanishing into the impenetrable dark of the coastal forest. The narrator slowly turned his head, tracing the footprints backward along the beach to discover their origin point. He pointed down the shoreline. Edwin followed his gaze. Sitting roughly 50 yards down the beach, dragged carelessly onto the wets, and was a small, pitch-black wooden rowboat. The heavy wooden oars were resting quietly inside the hull. It was the exact same vessel they had seen in the fog. A morbid, terrifying curiosity gripped the narrator. He instinctively took a step toward the black boat, desperate to look inside, desperate to see what kind of entity could orchestrate this impossibility. Edwin violently grabbed his shoulder, his fingers digging into the neoprene wetsuit. Edwin's face was entirely drained of color, his eyes wide with a primal, animalistic terror. He stated, in a voice completely devoid of argument, that they were leaving immediately. The horrifying mathematics of the timeline finally clicked in the narrator's brain. They had been sprinting for the shore in sleek, modern kayaks. The dark vessel was a heavy, lumbering rowboat. For that black boat to be sitting on the beach, the entity rowing it would have had to outpace them in the fog, reach the shoreline long before they did, drag the heavy wood onto the sand, and casually walk barefoot down the beach to the exact coordinate where the two men were destined to land, all before silently retreating into the forest to watch them arrive. It was an impossible ambush. They scrambled frantically back to their kayaks, shoved them violently off the mudbank, and paddled away from the shoreline like hunted prey. For 6 years, the narrator has desperately tried to apply a thick layer of rational logic to that morning. He tries to convince himself it was an impossibly elaborate, highly coordinated prank by a psychotic local. But deep down, he knows the truth. No human being could orchestrate that level of physical impossibility. When you step into the fog, you are stepping onto an entirely different playing field. And out there in the white void, you are never the one making the rules.